heading in. A couple more folks have come. All right. Thank you so much for all of your patience. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and we'll get started together in our class. This is our 8th session together. And as you know, from time to time, I may look a little distracted, and that's because I'm trying to let people in. Like right there, we just got someone else who came in. So it's good to see all of you. Good to have you on Zoom to be able to be together again for this week for our installment of our Sunday school class, Rebels, Radicals, and Ranters, the unexpected history of congregationalism. As we mentioned before, we have several reasons for why we're trying to wrestle with our history, right? Including our tagline for this year of thinking about what does it mean to be the church. Obviously, we've been having conversations in the church about the possibility of changing our name and what would that name be if we did change it. What are the things from our tradition and history that we truly value and love? The things that we think are essential, where are the parts that maybe are more problematic? That's all a part of taking stock and engaging our history. So as I've mentioned before, I'm not going to kind of go all the way back. Obviously, we're into session 8. We're scheduled to have 10 sessions, and I can tell you we're going to do a second part in the winter. It's going to be shorter. It's going to be 5 to 6 weeks because it's going to bring our story up to into the 20th century. I think we're going to be very fortunate to have completed a discussion around the Civil War and some of the things post-Civil War, and then we want to kind of bring things further up into the present. So I hope you'll be able to join us for that. And if you can't be here live, obviously you can also have access to it via YouTube. So without further ado, we have been moving through our history starting in England, following the migration of various Congregationalist inspired figures, also eventually coming to be called Puritans in North America as they make their way into Holland and then over to North America, working through kind of taking the time really to understand the original vision of these churches and what it was that they were trying to accomplish. Also, of course, considering some of the deep contradictions to a certain extent, I think is what we would probably have to say in terms of fleeing religious persecution only to establish something that was not capable of handling religious difference in this context. And of course, also the interactions with native peoples, with the growth of the slave trade, which was becoming a central engine to the world economy at that time. So all those things have been sort of on the table as we've been moving through together. So last week, we'd gotten ourselves out of that first generation, skimmed over the second and third, and brought ourselves up into the fourth generation, which we're talking here about the 1700s. And there, I think it'd be fair to say, if we're talking about the 1700s, really, there are two broad elements that we have to wrestle with to understand our own tradition and how was it kind of living out its calling in the midst of the world. The first, of course, was the Great Awakening, and that is something that we discussed last week. So this is that fourth generation. How are we going to reformulate the vision in this new context where religious tolerance is going to have to be something, where the ability of the church to control the levers of governmental power is coming increasingly under question and strain, where we have the demography of the colonies is radically changing in terms of church membership and those kinds of questions. So there's a central sense that, yes, the old vision is just not going to be plausible. We need to come up with something new. We need to reformulate how we're thinking about that. The second kind of thing that we talked about last week, though, and I think probably the central thing really was that first of those two big challenges that occurs in the 1700s, and that's the Great Awakening. And we worked through that and talked about the significant divisions that the Great Awakening created, that some churches were not convinced that the events of the Great Awakening were actually from God. In fact, the backdrop that you see here is a broadsheet picture depicting, I think that's George Whitefield, as someone who is being controlled by demonic powers, right? And so this is an example, sort of a propaganda example of an anti Great Awakening element. And if you remember, there were several things that we brought up. Some of it was theological, but a lot of the opposition to Whitefield and to basically this larger movement had to do with some of the ways in which this was challenging the social and political arrangements at the time. And we can describe that on the level of what we might call democratizing. So there's a famous book, the title of which is The Democratization of American Christianity, which I think captures that sensibility of a leveling of a society that at the time is much more stratified and hierarchical. And so that was seen as a threat by people who would have cherished that older vision of society. The other element that I talked about is, of course, that this is the time when we really do see, in a sense, the birth, at least in North America, of the Afro-Protestant church. And there's a significant response to some of the elements that are going on in the Great Awakening from indigenous tribes, groups, peoples, etc. And so all of that, in a way, challenges assumptions that are prevailing, whether it has to do with assumptions about the nature of slavery, about the slave trade, about racial assumptions. And this is a period, I would say, in which slavery has pretty much become racialized by this point in time. And so that's another kind of issue that'll come up actually as we move forward. So once we dismantle slavery, something else still seems to remain. The key figure that we talked about last week, of course, was Jonathan Edwards, really because he is the most significant figure who attempts to do this reformulation or modification of the Calvinist or Puritan vision. And he also, of course, is central because he is, it's in his church where some of the earliest inklings of an awakening appear to have happened, at least in New England. He writes this very influential text called The Faithful Narrative. That's sort of the shortened title. That's published and it makes its way across the Atlantic. And John Wesley and George Whitefield read this text and they decide, hey, we want to get involved in this move of God that seems to be happening over in North America. And so Whitefield himself comes over, and as we mentioned before, he winds up preaching all the way all across the Eastern Seaboard and taking what had been local, somewhat separate kind of religious revivals and cohering it into a larger single phenomenon. So Edwards is responsible in some significant ways for that. And we talked about the ways in which he sought to modify Calvinist doctrine. And, you know, we don't need to go into all the details of any of that stuff. I really just shared it with you more so that you could see the spirit of innovation and the lack of hesitancy to need to rethink the formulations that had sort of been tried and true from the perspective of the Puritans, right? We need to update the way that we talk about God because the situation, the context has changed. And maybe we need to take account of certain critiques, etc. All right, so that kind of gets us through our last week. Let's turn and start to talk about this week. And basically, I have, let's see, I'd say I've got 4 big things. So I have a feeling we'll get through 2 if we're lucky. Just because that's sort of the way things unfold for us. So the first thing, and really this is that second factor in the 1700s, and that is the revolution. So if we're going to say that, what are the 2 big challenges to the churches, and of course the big social challenges in a sense in the 18th century? One is going to be the Great Awakening, and the other is going to be the revolution. Now, the first thing before I kind of go in, I do want to set a kind of broader context because I think the American Revolution has to be seen in a much broader context, and that is the context of the 18th century Atlantic. In fact, I think this period is sometimes called the Revolutionary Atlantic because this is the time of the rise of massive merchant ships and fleets, shipping. There's constant engagement going on between 4 continents, right? So Europe, North America, Africa, South America, the Caribbean obviously is not a continent, but it still makes up. So we need to see this as part of a much bigger pattern of relations and not just something that sort of is only happening in a certain place and only has a rationale from within that place. There are numerous revolts, and sort of the revolutionary spirit, we might say, is actually in the air, kind of constantly swirling. And I give to you here kind of a list of just a few, really, of some of the most significant revolutionary moments. So the New York slave insurrection is actually a mixed race event that happens in 1741, taking place in New York City. Tacky's War is another slave revolt, massive one that spreads not only throughout all of Jamaica, but into other islands in the Caribbean. That begins 1760. Then you have the American Revolution, and I give to you here sort of the period 1765, which kind of marks the Boston Massacre up to 1783, when the war itself officially ends. So it goes from being kind of a rebellion or a revolt, I suppose we could say, in 1776 to becoming an all-out war, and that comes to an end in 1783. The French Revolution, right, 1789, 1799, and then the very important Haitian Revolution, also, right, and these are, these become essentially permanent in a real way. The American, French, and Haitian, their impact goes much further than some of these others. There's also a very important rebellion that happens in Ireland in 1798, which is a rebellion of both Catholics and Presbyterians in alliance together over against the English establishment. And then I kind of included here, just to round it out to the year 1800, though that's sort of artificial, the conspiracy of Gabriel Prosser and others that was going to lead to a major, they believe was going to lead to a major slave uprising that would have included white, black, etc. There are also other smaller revolts, riots, anti-government actions that are going on. And I think what we can see here, in a sense, is that there is a very large struggle, we might say, around freedom, around the question of freedom. What does freedom look like? What should it look like? What are the social institutions that should be in place to ensure that it actually can be pursued? And of course, one of the big questions, right, is can something like the institution of slavery really coexist with an argument around the need and necessity of freedom? And so this stuff is swirling around constantly, and it's not an accident then that we're going to find different theologians and church figures reflecting on this from within a Christian framework and perspective. One thing we can say, I think, in addition to this, as we think about who is it that's making up sort of the what we might call the motley crew of revolutionaries, that it's a mixture, and some of this I think fits for a number of these. And that is that you have sailors and dock workers, right? So this is where that revolutionary Atlantic component is very important. The port cities and their connections to other port cities. So the internationalism of this is significant. Former soldiers. So sailors and soldiers are going to be very important, in part because most armies during this time are not professional armies. They are armies that are created through impressment. And an impressment is literally going down the street and grabbing someone off the street and impressing them into the army or into the Navy. And this was viewed by, certainly in the British context, as another form of slavery. And so you can understand why they would have an argument about freedom, and you can understand why they would see their own self-interest as tied also to people who also are living in enslaved conditions, whether they're talking about plantation conditions or otherwise in North America or the Caribbean or whatever. So sailors, dock workers, soldiers, formerly enslaved and enslaved, indigenous people, religious personalities, also significant in this argument. And the sense of circulation, I think, is important. And as you can see, they all have a kind of shared interest in resistance to tyranny, which is, of course, why up here at the top I said this is a revolutionary Atlantic with numerous revolts and rebellions against imperial interests. So it's the question of empire is in fact being questioned. I think it'd be fair to say in all of these, and we need to see most of these as somehow connected. Now, for our context, very importantly for our story is the role that Boston plays. Let's see here. I'm moving around here. And as I was kind of doing some research on this, I've been doing a lot more reading around some of this stuff just because it's so fascinating. Some of it's been because it's connected to our class. But I came across this phrase that I thought you would all appreciate, and that certainly fits probably into the stories that we've heard. And that is that Boston was called the metropolis of sedition. That it was the most unruly of unruly spots, and in particular from British authorities, they viewed it as a deeply dangerous place, not just because of what happened on the ground in Boston, but because of the significance of the port, right? Boston's port and its role in the various trades that are going on, including the slave trade. But the ability then, right, of sailors who pick up ideas and practices in one place to then export those to another. That's kind of the idea that they get at. But Boston, right, as central to this story, and of course Boston has been central to the story we've been telling. So I think it would be pretty much impossible for us to assume that congregationalism or the sort of the polity, the notion that average people should have a say in the forming and running of a church, that this didn't have some kind of backdrop role in creating, fomenting some of these ideas. We can also say, certainly when we now kind of bring ourselves back from the broader Atlantic context to think about the American Revolution, there are then, therefore, given the fact that we have this kind of motley mix of different people, there are going to be all kinds of different motivations to become engaged in the American Revolution, at least in terms of the way that it starts, right? So I think we can say that we have sort of the traditional argument, right? Repressive taxation, government policies, the leftover ramifications of what eventually came to be called the French and Indian War, which happens in the 1760s. There's also, though, we find if we read the Declaration of Independence, there's frustration among white colonial leaders that they can no longer take land from indigenous people kind of willy-nilly the way that they had been doing it, and got permission only from local colonial governments. They actually have to go to the crown, so they're very upset about that. There is at the same time also a deep sense of anger over a series of just we might call specific policies and practices like impressment, like the slave trade. There's also, and this is interesting, I'm only just beginning to learn about, there's a shift that's going on during this period of not just talking about the rights of Englishmen, right, that are secured by some sort of political tradition, probably more than likely we could say rooted in the Magna Carta, which is of course a very important document. But now to argue that those rights don't just extend to Englishmen, they extend to all people. And so we start actually to see phrases around human rights also during this period. And so I think these are all components in the mix, in the hopper. And so whenever we look at any individual who gets involved in the revolution, we probably want to realize that there's a mixture of things at play. So I'm not going to go into tons and tons of detail. I just want to give this, I want you to have the sense that this is swirling around. It would be impossible to avoid it. And it therefore adds to that sense of ferment and change, which is going to become important, particularly as we move into the 19th century. Because once the revolution is completed, it's not like the question of how do we realize freedom is completed, right? And I think you all already know that on a deep level. You just lived through another election, right? And the constant mantra, right, is that we have to struggle to keep our republic, et cetera, et cetera. So questions about what does freedom look like? What are the institutional mechanisms that would make that possible? How does that conform to other kinds of questions, economic, et cetera? All that stuff is going to be there in the air. So what are a couple of things that we can say in regards to the congregational context that we've been trying to explore in our class? I think there are two things that are, it seems to me, important. One is that pretty much overwhelmingly, I probably shouldn't even remove, I should probably just remove this little, it says generally supportive. It really just needs to be supportive. I've found very little evidence that from congregational circles, people were against the revolution. In fact, we would probably, I think, be if we were to talk about the besetting sins kind of issue, right? That over identification with one political cause or another. That in this period there might be an over identification of God's will with the revolution, right? That's how strongly and intensely we see in the sermons and in the writings and pamphlets that are produced from congregational circles. There is a sense, right? There is a basic sense that that God is opposed to monarchy, and that republicanism really is the best form of governance and is maybe even derivable from Scripture. Those are the kinds of arguments that you're getting from congregational leaders. So what are a couple of things that we can include with this? And this is going to be one that I want to highlight here because it's going to become important as we move through. And it also fits, I think, pretty well with the basic DNA of our tradition. And that is the shift away from the necessity to be obedient to authority to the necessity to enact liberty, right? So enacting liberty, enacting freedom, and that's going to create a different set of challenges, right? Because it's not just any kind of freedom that Scripture seems to talk about. It's a very specific one. But now you have this very strong rhetoric, right? So among churches, particularly those who had been very important, very positively disposed towards the Great Awakening, which we remember was not all of them, liberty, human liberty, has already become an important theme, right? Because the ability of human beings to respond to God's grace, this is a central question that the awakening itself has raised prior even to the period of the revolution. During the period of the revolution, though, this theme, this shift becomes even more and more striking, right? Conspicuous. And that is a shift then away from the necessity to be obedient to those who have been put in authority, and now a shift to struggle for freedom and to become a responsible person, right? Someone who is responsible with one's freedom. We can see throughout the one of the little notes I picked up in some of the reading I was doing was that John Locke, who you may have heard of before, but Locke is one of the central sort of intellectual influencers of the American Revolution in his two treatises of government. These materials are being published in England and are making their way into the colonial setting in the mid 1700s. And they're being read, and very quickly, quotes from Locke are showing up in the sermons that are being preached. And these are typically going to be quotes around securing liberty, allowing people to have a voice, etc., in terms of self-determination. The other major theme that also shows up in support is one that I've already kind of alluded to, that has a shadow side that we can talk about, but this is the longstanding interest of turning to the history of Israel to find examples for how we should live as a community. So it's particularly the political examples. So there basically are two major texts that show up in the preaching during this period. One of them is the Exodus event, right? You can imagine, right? So Exodus becomes important. The need to flee out of the bondage of Pharaoh, all of that very significant as we think, as these folks are trying to make sense of why they should engage in some form of revolutionary politics. Of course, at the same time, the contradiction, right, of should there be slavery? And you can have people who hold both of those things in their mind, even if they don't know how they mesh. And you can have other people who don't, who will reject slavery and be pro-revolutionary at the same time. So you can find all kinds of those folks. The other thing, though, is I think it's the story in 1 Samuel chapter 8, or maybe it's 2 Samuel, I can't remember, but it's basically when the people clamor for a king, right? And so that leads to the selection of Saul. And before they clamor for a king, Yahweh basically turns to the people and says, this is what's going to happen. The king is going to effectively enslave you. So you want to be like the nations around you, it's going to end up in your own bondage. So these two passages, though, become like, they become very important, and they show up again and again and again in the preaching in New England churches, particularly among pro-revolutionary folks. Now, the Israel thing is going to prove to be problematic later on, because it is basically another example of what we have come to call, I think, American exceptionalism, right? This belief that what's going on in North America is in some way a redo of what God did with Israel. The implication of that meaning that we are the chosen nation now. We are truly the ones who are blessed and called to do a certain kind of mission in the world. And this is not just, by the way, this is not just something that happens in North America. This is going to show up in the 19th century in Britain, in France, in Italy, in Germany, and in Russia. All of those areas are going to have a similar kind of discourse about how they think they fit into God's grand scheme of things. So this is not just an American problem. This is a problem that shows up elsewhere. But the root of some of this we can kind of see sort of here and a little bit earlier. We've already talked about the use of understanding themselves as Israel and what that meant for native peoples. Okay, last set of comments before I kind of shift to a few other developments that I think are kind of helpful to know. And that is, so we have generally supportive, and now we have disestablishment. So disestablishment simply means the church no longer being economically supported by the state, and no longer will the state have a function in enforcing church laws or statutes or doctrines, right? So this is what we now probably, if you've probably heard the idea of separation of church and state, right? So this is the period in which that is becoming more and more going to be the reality. So it doesn't happen, though, overnight, right? The process of disestablishment, of loosening the ties between political authority and church authority, has been going on prior to this, but it gets accelerated through this period as they begin to try to think about, well, what does freedom look like? What should it look like? What are we trying to do in regards to religion, et cetera? So as I say here, it sort of accelerates it, but not completely, right? So as I say, as it says here on the screen, Connecticut, Massachusetts, and New Hampshire already prior to the war have moved into a more tolerant posture. They have not completely disestablished the congregational churches in these areas. They are still state supported and funded, but they have passed laws to make toleration more and more the reality. So people are not going to be economically or politically penalized if they go to the Anglican church or the Quaker church or whatever. Rhode Island, of course, is established as on the basis of freedom of religion. So they never have an establishment issue. And then I think sort of the closest to New England that we might think of as another example would be Pennsylvania, also a state established precisely to have freedom of religion. So prior to this, they were already moving towards toleration. That picks up pace, and we see official disestablishment happen well into the period of the early republic. So Connecticut in 1818, New Hampshire in 1819, and Massachusetts is the last state to officially disestablish the Congregational Church, and that happens in 1838. So disestablishment now is going to mean a new set of challenges, right? If the state no longer supports you, right, you now have to you have to reformulate and think what you're not just thinking about where's the money going to come from. You have to now think about, well, what exactly is our role in society? Like, what is the social function of the church? What kind of role does it have? Because before, with establishment, there was a de facto answer to that question, that somehow the church existed to give some sort of religious sanction to the policies of the state, right? And once this disestablishment happens, that question opens up and new kinds of answers can be given. All right, so let me stop there and take a break from my talking, and you haven't listened to my voice, and see what kinds of comments or questions you might have.
Christian?
Yeah.
I have a question. So the whole concept of a republic versus a democracy, or a republic trying to maintain some kind of majority rule with minority rights, and a pure democracy, maybe not protecting those minority rights as much. Does this come from Locke, and then how do you implement that where you protect, you're protecting minority rights?
Well, I can't answer that question on the whole. I can say that having spent a significant amount of time teaching through the Federalist Papers, that one way that the founders, at least, and the people who are sort of trying to conceptualize what are things going to look like going forward, is to proliferate factions. That the way that you protect minority rights is that you continually encourage what's called factionalism, I suppose we might say. And because the more factions you have, the less likely it is that there will be one group that takes power over everything. The groups are going to be forced to have to compromise with one another. And so factionalism is a component part, at least, of how they're imagining that they're going to create this. But beyond that, I'm not sure that I can answer that question. And I sort of be loath to jump in too much. I hope that's not too disappointing, John, but that's about the best I can do. So it looks like I've got two questions in the chat. Elgin, yes. So Elgin's first question is, did the discussion of human rights extend to women and blacks? Well, of course, it depends on who we're talking about. But the figure that I was thinking of, the example I was thinking of, was the Despard faction, the folks who wind up getting arrested and executed in late 18th century London. And they are definitely conceptualizing this along the lines of an interracial and intergender human rights. But I would need to have a little more time to kind of unpack that. And I would imagine that it probably depends on the person that we're talking about, because it's quite clear that you can have people who are vehemently against the institution of slavery, but are just as equally against blacks and whites learning to live together, or that we would certainly call them racist, I think, but there might be an even better descriptor that we could use. In the Hawthorne Scarlet Letter, he describes a very heavy-handed Puritan church. Was it still like that in the early 19th century? No, I don't think that. I think generally the feeling is that Hawthorne is sort of projecting something backwards. And of course, Scarlet Letter has been one of those popular tools that has kind of shaped the way that we think about Puritanism. But I don't think we can describe it that way. Last question is, when did the Unitarian split occur? And I'm going to tell you, I hope, in just a few minutes, because that's definitely a part of the story that I'm hoping that we might be able to get to today. But I appreciate your asking that, Steve. That kind of sets me up. Before I turn to that, Since I don't have any other questions right now, let me just kind of move us forward just a tad. And I just want to I'm throwing this under other developments, in part because we haven't really talked about some of this, but I think it's important. And one of them is how are the churches engaging in worship? I mean, I think a lot of you, when you think about church, one of the first things that probably comes to mind is music, like either you participate in the choir, or you sing, or you have favorite hymns, things like that. So how are folks engaging in this? And I can give a very super fast story, and not too deep, but enough to give you a sense of the change. So the first thing to note is that in most congregational circles, they are not only not using instruments, but they also were not using notation, musical notation. And you had to sing by memory. And so usually the texts were coming from the Psalms, which is, of course, a practice in keeping with the recommendations that came out of Geneva and John Calvin. But one of the things as I was kind of reading through, again, doing research for our class, it's pretty clear that throughout the 17th century, so the 1600s, so the period of that first and second generation, that the singing was not good. And there are constant complaints, apparently, in journals and diaries and letters about how bad congregational singing was. And what I mean by that is that people just couldn't sing. They didn't have a choir. There were no choirs. There were no use of instruments. And of course, without notes, people don't even know how to keep the tune. And so you see this kind of complaint throughout much of the 17th century. And it's really only as we transition into the period we've been talking about, this fourth generation, that we start to see changes, which is kind of shouldn't surprise us because we've seen changes in other areas. And so the first time we start to have choirs, and these are not paid choirs, these are just people in the church who can actually sing. They start to appear in the mid 1700s, and they start to be featured in worship. And they begin not only to move away from the use of psalms, but to adopt a lot of the hymns that are being written during this period, which of course are going to also include musical notation. And so alongside of the Wesleys and others who are writing hymns, probably the most important hymn writer, at least the one that I've stumbled upon, I would say in my little bit of research on this, in congregational circles, is Isaac Watts. Right? So Isaac Watts becomes a very central figure in this. Interestingly enough, the adoption of choirs actually happens after the adoption of musical instruments. So musical instruments are being incorporated into worship already in the early 1700s. And it begins with the incorporation of the violin or the cello. And by around the 1730s and 40s, the flute is starting to be used. And so musical instrumentation is beginning to appear. And then this is going to broaden out to the use of hymns and hymnals, etc. So I just figure, particularly given the interest of our church in questions of music, that this would be interesting to know. So a lot of things are changing. The other thing that I think is important to note for this period is the seating arrangements in the meeting house. So the meeting house is just my word for the church building, the typical church building in New England. Prior to this period, the seating arrangements, which were put together by the deacons, were arranged according to social hierarchy. And what that means is according to wealth, according to age, and according to, there was a category, and here it is, a category called people of usefulness. And exactly what that means is not entirely clear, but I think we can probably guess that it means people who maybe they are not from the aristocracy, but maybe they have legal training. Yeah, or maybe they have a larger farm, or they've been more successful as merchants, etc. So and what I mean by the arrangement here is we're talking about who sits at the front, in the middle, and in the back of the church. And then there are also, it's quite clear that there are balconies where children and African Americans, whether they're enslaved or not, and indigenous people, whether they are enslaved or not, are all put up in those balconies. So this is the situation in the meeting house. And it's during this period, right around the revolution and just after, that this starts to break down. And so churches, in particular in Eastern Massachusetts, start to move away from hierarchical seating during this period. Now, it doesn't go away immediately, but the change is beginning to happen. And so this fits in, I think, to this broader notion of a democratizing kind of spirit during this time. The last thing that I have under the other developments is the growth of theological factions that are occurring in congregational circles. I think I'd mentioned to you that in some ways the theological factions I'm about to describe go back to the Great Awakening, right? They have to do with how do people respond to the awakening? Do they see it positively? Do they see it negatively? Or is it mixed? Whatever. And so basically, though, this grows into two broad factions that are going to pretty much do kind of like political warfare, we might say, regarding institutions, et cetera, moving all the way through the 19th century and up into the 20th century. So the first faction we might call the New Divinity. That's the phrase. Another phrase that's been used for this to describe this is called the New England theology. This movement would look to Edwards as their primary example, and it's an attempt to modify Calvinism and reformulate Calvinism with some level of emphasis on human responsibility and freedom. And we talked a little bit about Edwards' attempt to do that last week. His theory of what he called compatibilism, right? So, but it gives you a sense that they are retooling things. We might say that this group is based at Yale Divinity School, and Andover Theological Seminary, which I'm going to talk about in just a few minutes. Those are kind of the two primary theological institutions that embody the spirit of this tradition. There is, by the way, there's a third group that's much smaller, and I'll mention that in a minute, but there really are two major groups. The second group is, I'm sorry it's not listed here, but we should really just call it the liberal wing of the church. And so this is the group that's going to be located primarily Eastern Massachusetts, the Boston area. They begin to dominate the churches in the Boston area. They wind up dominating Harvard. So Harvard Divinity School becomes their primary institution. And this group, we might say, basically rejects Calvinism, has pretty much decided that Calvinist notions of double predestination make God into a moral monster. They make it impossible to talk about human beings being able to be held responsible for their choices. They argue that a lot of the development and some of this group is going to give birth to Unitarianism. But they make the argument that later developments in Christian doctrine actually obscure our ability to read the Bible, and that what we really need when we read the Bible is simply our common sense, etc. So this is another significant group, and these then wind up giving you two broad factions in the church, and a set of institutions.
I hit mute, but now I've unmuted. And
All right, let me stop there for a second.
okay, well, whatever.
Christian, I think you froze up for about 20 seconds there.
Oh, good, not just me.
Am I back?
You're
Yes.
back, yes.
Okay, I apologize.
Like you have control of it.
John, do you remember what I said at the very end?
No.
Okay.
Your last bullet point there, you were talking about, but I can't remember specifically when where you went from there.
Okay, so I talked through the last bullet point, right? Rejecting Calvinism.
And the beginning of Unitarianism.
Yeah, so this is going to be, it's going to be this group out of which Unitarianism is going to come. And I think it's fair to see this group as a kind of back to the Bible movement, in which they argue that church doctrine, actually, the historical doctrine actually obscures our ability to read the Bible as opposed to helping us read it. And so this is going to be one of the reasons why eventually they're going to reject Trinitarianism, because they think it's an imposition on Scripture. So, but it fits, I think, pretty well in a culture that's starting to talk about freedom, right? How do we take account of freedom if we've constructed a picture of God in which human beings have no freedom, which is the way that they would interpret Calvinism. And so you can see both of these traditions are trying to grapple with this, so they have different types of answers for that. So let me stop and see what kind of comments or questions you might have.
Christian,
Yeah.
I'm pretty confused about this difference between Calvinism and Arminianism, as far as it has to do with who is saved and how are you saved, and how does that, come about that they have such a different view of things? And
Well, so Arminianism is an internal Calvinist position, right? So some of your confusion is, I think, entirely warranted, because Arminians would argue that they also believe in double predestination. But what they think determines your destiny, this is where there's going to be a difference between an Arminian and a Calvinist during this period. The Calvinist is going to argue that what determines your destination is God's decision, period, pro or con. The Arminian is going to argue that what determines your destination is in some way influenced by whether or not you accept the gospel or not. So they're not going to argue that human beings have total freedom, but they are going to argue that in the offering of the gospel, a moment opens up in which you can freely choose to embrace or reject. And that when you do that, you seal your own fate. I mean, both positions are I think, somewhat incoherent in certain kind of ways, but I don't want to digress into all of that. But that's the basic argument. And we could say an Arminian position then is trying to emphasize, highlight human freedom, whereas a Calvinist tradition is trying to emphasize or highlight what they would argue is God's grace, right? Because God makes the decision based on grace. So if that would be a fair description of at least how they would articulate their own positions. Now, as these two traditions develop, the Arminian tradition, in some ways, is eventually just going to, some portions of it is going to remove double predestination altogether. But they're still going to have this concept of, can human beings respond or not, right? And in a culture at the time, right, in which democracy is becoming more and more of an option, or at least democratic participation, you can understand why an Arminian position would have more cultural cachet, because, right, it's saying you can also choose God, right? That's also your responsibility. And so I think that gives us a sense of why they start to catch on. It's not just about theological argumentation, it's also about social utility.
Christian, one question. When I think of Jonathan Edwards, I naturally think of his phrase, sinners in the hands of the angry God. Does this relate to his, those who aren't chosen then would be going to hell?
Yes. Yeah, that sermon is, unfortunately, that sermon is the one that most people know Edwards by, the title. And it is very much a harrowing, I would say religiously abusive to a certain extent sermon, but it does encapsulate his approach to Calvinism to a certain extent, right? And the basic point of that sermon is that you are provoking a God who currently dangles you. You're in a very precarious situation, and your unwillingness to respond to God is a provocation that I don't think you realize the repercussions of it. If you read the sermon, I think that's kind of the basic spirit of it. So it does intersect with some elements of it. It's not just some people are going to hell. It really is an argument to people that he might say might have an opportunity to respond positively.
Christian, where do the deists fall in all this? The story.
Well, I mean, deism tends to be connected to the Enlightenment and Enlightenment figures, and some would argue that there are certain deistic impulses that might be found on the liberal side, but the liberals themselves are not deists. For instance, they uphold the full divinity of Jesus. They just reject Trinitarian doctrine is a good way of explaining that. And even among Unitarians, there's an interesting kind of wrinkle there as well. But so I think the most prominent deists are people like Thomas Jefferson, maybe Ben Franklin, et cetera, but certainly Jefferson would sort of embody that. And so it's a heavy reliance on human reason and the perfectibility of human beings, as opposed to reliance on a divine being. I have a lengthy lecture on this topic, but I'll spare you of that right now. All right, well, let me we have a few minutes left. Let me get through I don't know if I'll get into the Unitarian challenge, but I kind of want to set the stage because the question around human freedom, which clearly I think intersects with elements in our own tradition, right? I mean, one of the major things that we could say that's important about congregationalism is this belief in local autonomy, right? And the ability of the local church to take responsibility for itself. And so I think all of that kind of fits in pretty well with some of these impulses here. And obviously, socially speaking, and speaking in the context, the question about slavery is going to be central to this, right? And it's a constant challenge, we might say, to a certain extent. So I want to highlight here, we're going to come back to this, but I want to highlight here the sort of the initial impulses around abolition. And before I start going through this, I want to make clear that depending on the individuals that we might be thinking of and people that we might read, you can have, there are at least three different broad sets of questions that people might sometimes have different perspectives on that just don't seem coherent, but that they are, in fact, what we find in their writings. And this is certainly the case when we're talking about white, right, English, Anglo-American, right? When we get into Afro-Protestantism, typically they're going to answer all three of these questions in a single fashion. What I mean is people can have a perspective on the slave trade. They may have a perspective on slavery as an institution. And then they may have a perspective on what we might broadly call racial identity. And so this is a question around racism, integration, et cetera, right? So these three different things, and within these three different things, of course, you have an array of questions, okay? So for instance, I mentioned last week about Jonathan Edwards having slaves. Well, Jonathan Edwards was an opponent of the slave trade because he thought it was a dehumanizing thing, but he was a proponent of slavery as an institution. And I don't know how to answer the third question because I just haven't been able to do the research, but it wouldn't surprise me if he was not going to be a fair-minded in terms of maybe questions around racial equality or something like that. So more than likely, but I don't know the third answer, but you can see the complexity, all right? So if someone can be radically against the slave trade and yet still somehow be okay with people owning other people, right? And then as things evolve, people can be radically against both of those things, both the slave trade and slavery as an institution, and yet still be racist, right? So we can kind of see that, all right? So it's a complex thing that needs to be pulled apart each time as we move through. So the background here, first of all, just to keep in mind that New England is very definitely involved in slavery and in the slave trade from the 1630s on. Both African slavery and indigenous slavery, though the first forms of enslavement that are happening in New England have to do with the indigenous. Rhode Island, when we talk about New England's involvement, Rhode Island will play a central role in terms of all the New England colonies. They are the most important, probably, certainly in regards to the trade. And here we're talking not just, of course, about the trade itself, specifically the trading of other human beings, but also the products that slavery produces, right? So Rhode Island's most significant export during some of this period prior to the 19th century is rum. Well, rum is produced by sugar. Sugar is produced on plantations in the Caribbean, the work of which, the labor of which is almost exclusively enslaved, all right? So that's what I mean when I say they're involved. So they're very much involved, all right? At the same time, of course, we've also mentioned that there is a concern around missionizing, right? And some of this, of course, is problematic, and we highlighted some of that when we talked a little bit about John Eliot and the creation of praying towns, et cetera. But there's still a concern, right? And so we want to keep that in mind, missionizing indigenous as well as African folks enslaved. There's lots of contradictions in this. There's lots of questions about how should baptism work? If someone is baptized, does that mean that they should be set free? And I can tell you pretty much 95% of the enslaved are going to say yes, but the answer from the white side is going to be much more complicated, and generally no. In fact, they're going to start passing laws to make that clear. We also want to note that up until we get into about the mid to late 1700s, abolition either of the slave trade or of slavery itself as an institution is typically a minority position in New England. But something happens, and I think the two things that we can point to that are going to move the culture at least towards abolition of slavery, if not the slave trade, not saying racism, but slavery and the slave trade, the two most important things are the Great Awakening and the Revolution, right? These two things that have to do with common religious experience, human beings have certain freedom, etc. So this is all background. So what are a few things that we can kind of pinpoint? So first of all, and this is just sort of the growth of agitation, and we're going to come back, by the way, because Congregationalists do play a central role in abolitionism in the 19th century. And so that's one of the reasons why I want to just kind of lay this groundwork. So the first piece that's written that we could say, okay, this is definitely a congregational voice, comes from a layperson, a judge in the city of Boston, a guy named Samuel Sewall, and he publishes a piece called The Selling of Joseph, right? So he uses the metaphor when Joseph is thrown in the well and sold by his brothers into slavery. And this is an argument for the end of the slave trade. Sewall writes this in 1700. We then have the next probably major voice is also by a congregational layperson, not a clergy person, but this is a man named Nathaniel Appleton, also located in Massachusetts, and he publishes an attack on the slave trade in 1767. Then things ramp up pretty rapidly, and this is an indication that abolition then is going from being a very small minority to becoming a much wider position more broadly in New England society, with the publication and the sermons of Samuel Hopkins in 1776. The most important of these is his dialogue concerning the slavery of Africans. One of the reasons why I want to mention Hopkins is because he is the most important student of Jonathan Edwards. So he's really the guiding voice of the New Divinity Party. his both theologically speaking and clearly around issues of abolition. And he is against the slave trade and slavery as an institution, both of those. He is involved in establishing the Rhode Island Anti-Slavery Society in 1789. And then a second one is established under the leadership of the president at the time of Yale Divinity School, or Yale College, I should say, in 1790. So this period of revolutionary ferment, right? All three of those down there, 1767 up to 1790, all that is happening pretty much in the context of the revolution. And so that tells us that the revolution and these ideas around democracy, et cetera, are starting to affect the way that people are conceptualizing some of these other questions around slavery. Last thing to highlight then is the very significant figure of Lemuel Haynes. At least this is going to be the last thing to highlight until we return to this topic later. And Haynes is important because he is the first African-American to be ordained by a major Protestant denomination in the United States, and it is by a congregational church in Vermont. So he is ordained in 1785 by a congregational church. He winds up serving in a church in Vermont. Sorry about that, that's my dog. For about 30 years, mostly white church in Vermont. He's also a veteran of the Revolutionary War, and he's very, very active in terms of advocating for the abolition of slavery, the ending of the slave trade, et cetera. So he becomes, I think, a significant indication of the shift that's beginning to happen in congregational churches, and basically a broader embracing of certainly a broader conception of human rights, equality, et cetera. So let me stop there and going to unshare so I can see more of your lovely faces. And if you want to ask me some questions, you can do that.
I'm just going to make an observation, and that is, boy, I sure didn't know that last fact about Lemuel, and I'm amazed at how long it takes, I mean, that was a pretty radical change right there, yet we managed to still struggle, all these years later. I mean, just an observation and a frustration.
Yeah, I mean, it's still with us, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's the sins of the fathers sowing a bitter harvest. I mean, what else? I don't know whether there's so many images, right, that we could supply. I would say too, I was pretty shocked myself actually to find out that it was a congregational church in Vermont, because I thought it was the Methodists. But he beats out most of the Methodists by like 4 or 5 years. And I think that's a legacy that's worth noting, both as a positive, but also there are also going to be a lot of Congregationalists who are not going to be pro, equality or civil rights or things like that too. So there are lots of, as we know, right, our own church and community are divided over these kinds of issues. So thanks for that observation, Vivian. Other comments or questions? Yeah, Rick, go ahead. You need to unmute yourself.
So on average, how many books do you read in a year?
I don't know, actually. I stopped trying to keep track of that. A lot.
A lot.
Yeah.
I'm still working on the little engine that could.
Hey, I've got books that I've only made through the first chapter.
Me too.
So,
Down the same line, how many books do you write a year?
Well, I'm trying to finish one right now. I'm supposed to submit a manuscript on December 31st. So I have a few pages left in the last chapter, and then I have to write the conclusion. So I would appreciate all of your prayers because I don't know if I'm going to make it past over that finish line, but we'll see.
How many books have you written?
I've published 10 books.
Again.
Hmm.
Mute,
A lot of those are edited volumes.
mute. There.
So a couple of those are monograph.
Christian, I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead, Dave.
Okay. With the abolition of slavery in England during Wilberforce's time, I'm not sure where that history fits into what you've been talking about here in New England.
It fits in as a part of a network, a transatlantic network. So if we think about that transatlantic revolutionary spirit that produced all those revolutions that are going on, that same network, is still there after some of these revolutions have happened. And so the writings of people like Wilberforce and Wesley and others are also going to influence and become a part of the conversation going on in New England. And there's certain pamphlets that are going to be written in New England that are also going to become part of the conversation in England. I'm thinking about the writings of Equiano, right? Who is this figure who a black, I think he's Igbo. I believe his ethnicity is Igbo, so from Nigeria, but serves as a sailor, as a black sailor, becomes a very important voice in England, but also his writings make their way into, and he's one of the people who's kind of in the ear of Wilberforce and others. And some of his writings, though, make their way into the hands of New Englanders, et cetera. So it's still that kind of network sensibility that is shaping the discourse. And of course, the most important slave rebellion is the Haitian Revolution, and that is successful too, right? And so there are several other slave revolts that happened that are eventually suppressed, some of them quite ruthlessly, but that one is actually successful, and so that becomes a part of this conversation too. In terms of, and one of the interesting things about that, I've been kind of doing, again, some reading on that, is they actually defeat 3 different empires. Like they wind up defeating the French, the Spanish, and the British throughout the process of that revolution. And it's pretty remarkable if you read some of the history about that and the ways that they organize themselves, et cetera. So. All right, well, it looks like we've exhausted our comments and questions for today. I think everybody's probably just exhausted in general because there was something that happened last week. I don't know. But I do hope, just in light of that, that you're getting enough rest, taking care of yourselves, feeling God's presence in different kinds of ways, whether that's through participating here, Bible study, church, or just looking out the window. But my prayer for you is that you know God's peace, and I look forward to seeing all of you next week. And just say a quick word as we go. Lord, we thank you for this day. We thank you for the opportunity that we do have to look back, to be transported, to think about the challenges that others have faced and how they've done their best to be faithful in their time and place. Help us, Lord, to discern what that means for us. Give us the eyes to see and the hands to serve. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Blessings, everyone.